participants here. It's really, really something special. And thank you again, just as Kevin was saying, thank you to our amazing panel here. And it's been a real pleasure working with all of you guys here today. So I'm going to share my screen right now with you all. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what we are going to be doing today. So what we can do right now is first, I'm just going to let this kind of pan over this beautiful view. We're way above Jerusalem, above the Mount of Olives, and now we're actually even going and looking out into the desert just on the edge of Jerusalem. But as we're enjoying this beautiful view, I'm just going to explain a little bit about how the tour and how this whole experience is going to work. So the idea is that I'm going to be your tour guide and take you to all these sites all around Jerusalem. Many of these sites are sites that you wouldn't necessarily even get to go in person, including the site that we're on right now, where we're way up above in a drone, way all the way above Jerusalem. You wouldn't even get to do this if you were on foot. Now, part of the complications of doing a tour like this in Jerusalem is that there's a lot of names for very few things, and each of those names has a lot of meaning attached to those names, with a lot of history, and you can even say baggage behind all of those things. And I want everyone to know that throughout the tour, if I mention a word or a name of something that isn't the way that you from your faith calls it, I don't mean any sort of harm or offense. I'm going to do my best to, within the context of whichever religion I'm presenting, to use the term that religion presents. Sometimes I might fudge the word a little bit, and please don't take any offense to any of that. I mean it all in with a kind heart and a good smile as well. And so I hope that you guys all take it that way as well. And as well, that's also going to be part of one of the themes of today, which is that there's lots of places that have shared specialness or holiness between the three religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, that's one theme of today, is places that are shared. The other theme of today are going to be the places that we're going to go to that were once special or significant to one of the religions, and then that holiness or specialness shifted to another place for any number of different reasons that might have happened. We're not going to get into the whole histories of why those holiness places had to, in a way, shift, because part of the reasons weren't necessarily the most fun reasons for all the people involved. But what we're going to be talking about today is, again, the things that are on the ground, the facts that are on the ground. And throughout the tour, I'm going to be turning over the floor to Reverend Diaz, to Rabbi Wernick, and to Imam Badat, in order to, make sure that you're hearing all the voices and not just from me. Because again, as objective as I'm going to try to be, I know that every single person has an opinion and has a background. My background, so that everyone knows, is I grew up as a Canadian Jew in Hamilton, Ontario, so right around the corner from Toronto. As I like to say, the better version of Toronto, but people in Toronto think otherwise. But either way, I'm from Hamilton, Ontario originally, and I grew up very active in various Jewish summer camps and Jewish youth groups, and that ended up leading me to wanting to what's called make aliyah, or to go up, to move to Israel. And I moved to Israel in the summer of 2011, and I've been living there ever since. And so again, I come with some sort of background as well, and as objective as I'm going to be, my background always will come out in that kind of way, whether I like it or not, in that kind of thing. So while we're going to be on this tour, I just want to also give you a little pointer. So if you want to make the screen a little bit bigger for yourselves, you can move your mouse to the right side of the screen, and you can slide it over to the right, and you can make my face, the panel, a little bit smaller, and you can make the image that you're seeing in front of you a lot bigger. So with that, let's get started. So we're over here looking at Jerusalem. You can see the Temple Mount whole structure that's over here. But before we even look at the Temple Mount, I want to just look at what Jerusalem was over here. Now, this is Jerusalem if you strip everything bare, where the original core city of Jerusalem was not actually even from the top of this hill, and I'll explain why in just a second, but it started just down over here with the Canaanite city of Jerusalem, or the Jebusite city of Jerusalem, which famously, the person who would later become King David, that King David comes and conquers Jerusalem. Now, this spot on the top of the mountain where this little bulge is, where it says the label here, top of Mount Moriah. So that little bulge on the top is where, according to tradition, where according to basically everyone's tradition, where Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, where depending on the different stories or versions that you've read, there are whatever, we're not going to get into the whole sacrifice of Isaac story, but that is the place where it is. That spot was chosen according to Jewish tradition because it is from this stone over here that the whole world was created. Now, there's a few different places for various different religions where the world was created from, which rock it was created from. For Judaism, it is this spot that is over here. And on that spot, and on the spot of the sacrifice of Isaac, is also the spot where there was the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, if you look at the city of Jerusalem right now, so the old city is this whole big cluster that's over here. The part that was the original city of David, the original city that David called Jerusalem, or 3,000 years ago, was just this little part that's over here. And the temple wasn't even really initially part of the city of David. You can see what it would have looked like then. This is actually a few hundred years after King David, during the time of the King Hezekiah, where this is what Jerusalem would have looked like. But then what's amazing about this map that's over here that I'm showing you is that from the year 700 BCE, Jerusalem expands. And the reason why it expands is because there was a refugee crisis. And Jerusalem, for the first time in its history, had to grow, not just a little tiny bit, but to make it 3-4 times larger than what it was before, welcoming in the Israelites of the north in order to help save them from various different catastrophes. And so that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today, is Jerusalem as this inclusive place. Now, originally, where you see the Dome of the Rock, the golden, the beautiful, stunning Kuba al-Sakhra, where you see the Dome of the Rock over here on the Kuba al-Sakhra, on the whole Temple Mount. So this is what a recreation of what the first Temple of Solomon might have looked like 3,000 years ago. Here's an account of what the second temple would have looked like 2,000 years ago under King Herod. But at a certain point, this one is destroyed by the Romans. This one beforehand was destroyed by the Babylonians. And after the year 70 CE, when the Temple Mount was destroyed, the Romans and then later on the Byzantine Christians left it bare. And the reason why we know they left it bare was because they told us so, that in various different written accounts, they express how the Temple Mount was not to be inhabited by anyone at all. But even on the first map of Jerusalem, which is a mosaic that's found in Jordan to this day, mosaic that's found in Jordan, this is a map of Jerusalem where the Temple Mount should be this whole section that's over here, and this mosaic. It's a little bit hard to understand how this is a map. This is here Damascus Gate, this over here is Jaffa Gate, but if you draw a straight line from Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, you would eventually get to the Temple Mount. But you can see that it's literally been wiped off the map. Because, and there's a reason for that, because during the Christian period in the 300s, 400s, 500s, 600s, until the Muslim conquest in 638, the most important building in Jerusalem was this one, which is a church that's just a little bit inside the old city. It's hard to see from our angle, it's just over here. But that church is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the place where Jesus was crucified, later on buried, and most significantly, where, according to tradition, according to the New Testament, where Jesus was resurrected from the dead 3 days after he had been buried. And that spot over here becomes not just the holiest site for Christianity, but there's this new, in a way, mythology about it that the Byzantine Christians explore, which is that not only is this now the holiest site for Christians, but that the Temple Mount, where the temple once stood, all of that holiness from the Temple of Solomon, it's as if it physically moved to this new site just within the old city of Jerusalem. And we're going to go just outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in just a second, but this is just a view from above of the church, where in effect for Christians to this day, this is the temple. This is the place where the temple is, not just metaphorically, but really that whole holiness really physically shifted in a way, making it so that the Temple Mount itself was no longer special. But, one second. But there came a little bit of a problem. In the year 638, the Caliph Omar comes and conquers this area in a relatively peaceful manner. And he arrives at the gates of Jerusalem, and he says that he wants to go to see the Temple of Solomon. And the Byzantine Christians who are running Jerusalem at the time take him to this church, take him to the famous Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he goes inside, and he comes prayer time, and he's about to pray, but instead of praying inside the church, which he was welcome and invited to pray inside the church, he says, no, I'm going to step just outside the church, because if I pray inside the church, after me, they will turn this beautiful church, this beautiful place, into a mosque, which is not what it was originally designed. So instead, Omar goes across the way over here, and he prays just outside the church. And it's on this spot where you can see the minaret just above, where there is now a Mosque of Omar. That right next to the holiest site in the world for Christians, there's a beautiful, stunning mosque. And what's inside the mosque, just outside, there's a copy of the Pact of Omar, which is Omar promising that any non-Muslim, even though the Muslims are ruling Jerusalem and ruling this region at the time, that non-Muslims are allowed to practice as they wish. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed, even though in ancient times, this is the general idea of what you would do when you go conquer a city, is you either destroy or repurpose the holiest site of the people there in order to make it your own. And what does Omar do after he prays? He says, okay, this was the Temple of Solomon for the Christians, but now I want to find the Temple of Solomon for the Jews. And he finds a local Jewish person in Jerusalem and essentially finds a tour guide and says, hey, can you take me to the Temple Mount? And he takes him to the Temple Mount, and it is there that the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, these two buildings, are later on built. And after that beautiful story that really talks about this initial cooperation of Jerusalem dating to the year 638, we're now going to go back in time a little bit. And now we are in the room of the Last Supper, which is special for a number of reasons. But before we get into my reasons why it's special, I want to turn the floor over to Reverend Diaz.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yes, so the room of the Last Supper in Jerusalem. The room of the Last Supper is also called the cenacle, and it's considered the traditional site where Jesus celebrated. Jesus, of course, was a Jewish man, and he celebrated his final Passover meal with his followers, according to tradition in this room. There's certainly some debate among scholars around whether it's the actual place, if Jesus had actually had his last Passover meal in a room which you will later hear is above King David's tomb. It's likely the gospel writers would have mentioned that important detail. But the reason that this site is important in the Christian tradition is because the Last Supper, the final Passover meal that Jesus shared with his friends, was the foundation for the Christian sacrament of Holy Communion, also known as the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And at this meal, Jesus took a loaf of bread, according to the scriptures, and he said, "This is my body broken for you." And then after that, he took a cup of wine and he said to his friends, "This is my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of sins." And this is where he foreshadows his impending death. And he presents himself in a way, and as was later discerned by his followers, that he has presented himself as the sacrificial lamb of atonement. This being the Passover meal, he's presenting his own body, his own blood in sacrifice for atonement. And so in the Christian sacrament of the Lord's Supper, then, we remember Jesus' death as he commanded them when he said to his disciples at the end, "Do this in remember me. Whenever you eat the bread together, whenever you drink the cup together, do it in remembrance of me." And so that's what we do when we celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion, is we remember Jesus and his sacrificial death. Now, for this room, the room of the Last Supper, tradition also places a number of other biblical events in this particular place, including some events that will be familiar to Christians, when Jesus washes his disciples' feet. There are also times when, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his disciples in a room. They were closed in a room, and he appeared to his disciples. This is traditionally the site where the disciples gathered after the ascension of Jesus. This is the room that is traditionally where the election of Matthias as an apostle, they had to elect an apostle to replace Judas, of course. And so this is the room where that was said to have happened. And as well as the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the disciples on the day of Pentecost. So it has a number of meanings for the Christian tradition. It's important to note, though, that while, like I said, it's debated among scholars whether it's a historical location of these events, in some traditions, it's not the place where it happened that's most important, but rather the fact that it did happen and what the event itself meant more than what the location might have meant. And so for example, the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth effectively make the point about Jesus' Davidic lineage, and if with the tomb of King David being close by, that would have been something important to them, in establishing Jesus' Davidic lineage. But that's done in the Christian scriptures without this particular detail. The room of the Last Supper, though, in the room of the Last Supper, the Christians have the opportunity when they go to this place, when they go to this site, to reflect on that event, to reflect on the meaning of Jesus' death. And because that sacrament of Holy Communion is so important, then going to this place and remembering that event in the life of Jesus and in the life of his disciples is very sacred.
That was really beautiful, Reverend Diaz. If I can just point out a couple of things that continue to further the points that you were making, of course, is that this building of the Room of the Last Supper was built during the period of the Crusades, so during the 12th century. And what's interesting is that eventually it was turned into a mosque. For anyone who's familiar with mosques, you can see there's a mihrab that's over here, where this building was turned into a mosque, and all of the walls and all the ceilings were stripped of any of the images that you would normally find in a Catholic church, essentially, because the Crusaders were essentially Catholic, coming from Western Europe. So it was stripped of all of the images of animals and of landscapes and of people that were likely here. However, there are still some signs of some of the animals that were here. So one of them is a lion. You can see it's all connected to the top where the lights are. The lion, which is the symbol of David himself. There's another one. If you look way up above over here, where the lights hang down. So above over there is a lamb, which is a symbol of Jesus as well. And most interestingly, and most connected to this place over here, is in the corner of the structure where these pillars are that are over here in the corner, there's all of these pelicans. And pelicans are also a famous Christian symbol, an animal that is famous for, that pelicans were an early Christian symbol, because pelicans, when their chicks are hungry and they can't provide food for them, they will pick at their own breast and feed blood to their young, which is a real symbol of the Eucharist, of this Last Supper, that where Jesus is giving his body and giving his blood to the apostles that are with him. And just some other things that are around as well. Throughout the building, like many buildings that are built during the Crusader period, there are always crosses as graffiti, where the Crusaders who were coming in the 12th century and 13th century specifically, they were mostly illiterate, but they would come to these places and they didn't believe that Jerusalem existed. And not to make it seem silly or anything, but imagine telling, your kids after reading all of Harry Potter that, we're going to go to Hogwarts now. Like, yeah, come on. Hogwarts is this magical place. Now take that, but times a million, because you're going to a place where God walked, where God sat and ate his dinner. So it's this really interesting. You have to imagine the emotion that these people were feeling, and they couldn't sign their names, so instead they would put a cross. Now, as I mentioned before, it was also turned into a mosque, and you can see there's these stained glass that have Arabic writing on them, where the Arabic writing that are on both of the windows reference Surah 38, specifically 38:26, the verse 26 of the Surah 38, which is the story of King David and what is called the story David and the two litigants. But it's a story that is familiar for Jews and Christians as well from the Bible, which is when David is essentially chastised by the prophet Nathan for, in a way, stealing the wife of Uriah of Bathsheba. And this is the famous story of there's the shepherd who has 99 sheep and the shepherd who has one sheep, and the shepherd with 99 steals from the one. And David says that is very unjust. And then the prophet says that this is what you did, that you stole this wife from Uriah when you have many wives. And it's a slightly different story in the Quran, because in the Quran, he doesn't actually marry Bathsheba. He doesn't actually go through with the adultering in a way before for Christians and for Jews in the Bible. It is that he actually does go through with it. And the other thing that's on the wall is the Bismillah inscription, which is the opening phrase in the Quran, which means in the name of Allah. And for any of you who know Hebrew, Bismillah might sound a little bit familiar if you were to say Bishem Allah, in the name of Allah. So it's just an interesting kind of Arabic and Hebrew have so much in common, and it's just a really interesting thing to talk about that way. Underneath the Last Supper room is the room that is the tomb of King David, which is now a synagogue, which you can see at some point was also part of a mosque. There was a mihrab. The person who documents the discovering of King David's tomb is this traveler named Benjamin of Tudela, who traveled all around Southern Europe and all around basically the Middle East in the 12th century. And his account is pivotal to understanding what the whole region was like, and especially what the Holy Land was like during this time, and especially in Jerusalem. And he tells the story that I'm not going to get into the whole story of Jerusalem, but first, what's really interesting that he mentions about Jerusalem when he first arrives in the 12th century is that Jerusalem was this place where everyone got along. The people paid a little bit of tax to the king, and people lived in peace. Now, there weren't that many Jews that were allowed to live in Jerusalem, but as he says, there were Mohammedans, there were a number of different branches of Christianity that all lived in peace in Jerusalem. And he tells this story about finding the tomb of King David, which is in a way this miraculous story of these two people who are helping to build this church, but then they slept in and they didn't arrive to work on time, and then they had to work during their lunch break, and then all of a sudden, wow, what's this amazing tomb that's over here? And that is the legend of how King David's tomb was found on this spot. And all around it is a monastery that existed at that time. So now we've gone into a place where there is a monastery. There was a monastery, which you can see kind of from the small windows, and this is kind of the dining hall or kind of the courtyard that they would meet together. There was a synagogue down below. There's also this place that's open for Christian ceremonies, this place that's open for Muslim ceremonies as well. It's one of two buildings that we're going to be going to today, and the only two that I know of in all of Israel, which are places that serves as a church, a mosque, and a synagogue throughout the year, which is just really cool that it all happens in one building that's over here. The beautiful, stunning minaret that's over here is the minaret of Masjid Ibn Dawood, that when this place was a mosque, that it was known as the Masjid Ibn Dawood, that it is the mosque of David, King David. And this roof that's over here has a lot of different significance, not just that you can see a beautiful church that's over here and the beautiful minaret. And when you're here on the other side of the mosque, you can get on the other side of the roof, you can get a good view into Jerusalem. But I'm going to turn the floor over now to Rabbi Wernick to tell us about this little funny looking corner that's just over here on the side.
Thanks, Josh. So first of all, I just want to say a word about King David. King David, of course, is one of the most famous of the kings of Israel. He was the king that united the different kingdoms, conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and declared it to be the capital of Israel, the first commonwealth, so to speak, that he was king over. Of course, David, the word David in Hebrew means beloved. David was considered to be one of the beloveds of God. He was certainly, in the beginning anyway, beloved of King Saul, one of his predecessors. And the relationship that David had with Jehonatan, with Jonathan, his son, is one of an example of the great love amongst people that are not necessarily married to each other or related to each other. It's a friendship in which they acted as brothers, and for some commentaries of the Bible, even hints at perhaps something more romantic than that. David is known for being the writer of Psalms. Most of the Psalms in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are attributed to David. Many of them even begin with the words Mizmor le David. This is a psalm of David. And David is also known for the controversy over his beloved wife Bathsheba, in which he saw her from a balcony. She was married, and as king, he sent her husband out to the front lines of a particular battle, knowing full well that it was likely that he would be killed, so that she would then become a widow and he'd be able to marry her. As a result of that act, that sin, so to speak, David is punished by God and is informed by the prophet that he is not going to be able to build the temple that God's dwelling place on earth that he otherwise would have expected that he would have built at the top on Mount, the Temple Mount that we saw earlier at the beginning of the presentation. That privilege is passed to his son Solomon, to King Solomon. From David's line, according to Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, from David's line comes the Messiah, the Mashiach. Of course, there's divergent views between the religious traditions as to what are the conditions by which that Messiah is appointed and recognized. But in some ways, we're waiting around for the same thing, which is either the second coming or the first coming of the Messiah from the line of David. The room, that corner that Josh is referring to, is known as the President's Room. And I wanted to say something about the President's Room because it turns out I have a personal connection to this president. The President's Room is where in Pesach, probably beginning, I think, in 1960, when Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, who was the second president of Israel, he started going there in order to greet the worshipers for Passover. And then he started a tradition to be there for all the major holidays for the three monotheistic faiths that to this day continue to worship on this spot, which makes it very, very unique in Israel and probably very, very unique throughout the world. He would be there on Christmas, on Easter, on Passover, and on Ramadan in order to greet the different worshipers and to wish them shalom, salam, peace. One of the reasons why I find it so important to do that, Josh, I'm going to share my screen for a moment, if you don't mind. Let me try this again. I just want to show you a picture, if I can get it up here. Here we go. So this is Yitzhak Ben Zvi on the right, the second president of Israel. And on the left is my grandma Ada. You can notice that they look very similar. And that's because, as it turns out, they're cousins. Yitzhak Ben Zvi's mother and my grandma Ada's mother were first cousins. And my mother discovered this connection when she went to Israel in 1960 and was handed a history of our family from Yitzhak Ben Zvi, which I happened to be at this moment translating and learning about my family history that apparently Ben Zvi and his father were able to trace back to the 11th century. So it's been a tremendous journey for me in terms of my own family history to find out this connection that I have to Yitzhak Ben Zvi. And when I learned about the President's Room through Josh in preparation for this, that was very, very exciting. Ben Zvi, as you can imagine, as a result of his having a place like the President's Room, if you ask any Israeli who was old enough to be alive when Ben Zvi was president, what they would say is that he was a mensch. And certainly anybody who made it a point to greet people on their holy days on this particular site is that, a mensch being a really decent person in Yiddish. Thank you.
Just to add on to that is that Yitzhak Ben Zvi, when he was the president of Israel in the 50s and 60s, I think he's the only politician, if you can call the president a politician, it's kind of like a figurehead, but he's the only kind of great political leader in Israel's history that I would say that no one has a bad word about him. The right wing, the left wing, the Arab population, the Christian population, the Jewish population of all different sorts. No one says anything bad about Yitzhak Ben Zvi, which is, especially in political climate in Israel, it's very easy to find at least one person who is against what you have to say. Now, we've moved in away from the opposite side of Jerusalem. We've gone originally from the Mount of Olives to Mount Zion, where we went to the tomb of King David. And now we've gone back to the Mount of Olives, where we were before was just kind of floating up above, just above us a little bit ago. And now we're in this ancient church, which has gone through a few different renovations and remodelings over its centuries, which is known as the Church of the Ascension, which is the church that is dedicated and most famous for when Jesus went up to heaven, according to Christian tradition, where he went up to heaven after his days resurrected. And as Rabbi Wernick was saying, that Christians are waiting for that second coming for Jesus to come back for the second time. But this is the place where Jesus left from back up to heaven. But I'm not actually going to talk about the Church of the Ascension, even though there is plenty of things to talk about here. I'm going to swivel over to this side, because what I'm going to be talking to you about is actually just what's on the other side of this wall, which I'm going to show you in just a second what's there. But what's there is actually a tomb of a woman. And according to various traditions, it's a tomb of either Pelagia of Antioch, who is this great saint from the Orthodox Christian tradition, or it is Rabia al-Adawiya, or Rabia Basra, who is one of the first great female Sufi poet from the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, or it is the tomb of Huldah the prophet, who is a 7th century BCE prophet of the Jewish people that is in the Bible. Now, whose tomb was it originally? It's a little bit unclear. Most likely, originally, it was the tomb of Pelagia of Antioch, who, according to her story, and I'm going to tell her story first, just because the tomb was likely attributed to her first, where originally her name was Margarita. And what Margarita was famous for in the city of Antioch was that she was the greatest actress, also harlot, that was known in the city of Antioch. And she is wowing all of the city and all the travelers with her incredible good looks and her charm and her ability to just wow an audience. And one time, the audience that comes is the church council of Antioch, and maybe even further than that, of the whole region. And when the church saw her and her beauty, they immediately turned her eyes. They turned their eyes. But there's one bishop named the Bishop Nonus, and Nonus sees her body and is just entranced, just wowed. And he's getting castigated by the other church members saying, hey, what are you doing looking at this woman? She's immodest. And he says, in a little bit in jest, but also in a way to kind of dig at them, he says, this woman over here works on her body better and more often than you work on your soul. And he goes and he approaches Margarita and eventually has her come to one of his sermons. And then she ends up repenting and is baptized. And then eventually she moves to Jerusalem. I guess before that, Nonus gave her the name Pelagia to give her this whole new identity change as this now a saintly woman as opposed to the harlot of Antioch. And she comes to Jerusalem and becomes a monk. She disguises herself as a man, becomes a monk, and lives right here in Jerusalem and is buried just around the corner. Now, the story of Rabia Aladowiya has a little bit of similar overtones. I know all these things, there's parallels and there's things that aren't really parallels, but the important thing is that it's about these three women that all have followings and that all had very great impact during their time. And Rabia Aladowiya, she comes from this very poor, it was a poor city in Iraq of today called Basra. She's named Rabia because she was the fourth daughter, like from the word like for four in Arabic and in Hebrew. And she ends up, her father ends up being told from a prophecy that one of his daughters is this amazing saintly woman in a way. But Rabia Aladowiya is completely illiterate and she doesn't really know how to write anything down, but she speaks incredibly beautifully. And she ends up taking part in the Sufi movement of Islam, which I'm not going to get into the whole idea of it now, but it's this incredible philosophical and spiritual side of Islam, that was especially popular in its early centuries. And she becomes this very popular Sufi poet. And at a certain point, her father dies and they run out of money. And she gets captured by this caravan of thieves and she's sold to be a slave. But while she's a slave, instead of sleeping at night after slaving an all day long, instead of sleeping at night, she would pray. And one day her master saw her praying and there was this beam of light on her as she was praying during the night. And the master immediately realized that this is a woman of God, this is a woman of Allah, and freed her. And Rabia Basra, for the rest of her life, worked to free other slaves and became immensely popular in her day and became, again, the first of a long line of female Sufi poets from that period and for centuries later on. And the next story is of Hulda, where Hulda is this prophet who is little known. There's only, I think, 7 or 8 verses about her in the Book of Kings in the Bible, where when Hezekiah is poking around when Josiah is poking around in the temple and stumbles into this ancient scroll, he has to bring this scroll to someone to translate. And he doesn't bring it to the popular prophet of his day, Jeremiah. Instead, he goes to Hulda. And Hulda is the one who's meant to translate this book to everyone, meant to popularize it and to essentially give it credit to see if it was actually from God or not. Now, the funny connection with Hulda that she has, especially with Pelagia, is that she is also the descendant of a harlot, where Hulda is one of a few prophets, but she is noted in various Jewish sources afterwards that she is the descendant of Joshua and Rachav, who Rachav from Jericho was the harlot in Jericho who shelters Joshua. Now, I'm going to now take you into the tomb, because unfortunately Google Maps didn't let me take you in, but there's this amazing website that's over here that allows you to actually see the tomb that's over here on the inside, where as you can see now, it is dedicated to Rabbi Basra, as you can see from all the Arabic writing that's over there. But it is a place that is open for anyone to go to, and that you can go inside and you can think of this tomb as whoever is the one that inspires you most, whether it is Rabia, whether it is Pelagia, or whether it is Hulda. Now, just going back to what Reverend Diaz was saying earlier, is that there are various traditions of where all of these people are buried. That, in a way, on the one hand, you could say it takes away from the spirituality that these people, that there's conflict, that, oh, well, Rabia might be buried here, might be buried in Iraq, might be buried in Turkey. There's various different accounts, or Hulda being buried here, or Hulda being buried next to the Dome of the Rock. There's any number of different theories of where these people are buried. But in my opinion, all those ideas of where they're buried, the most significant part is that it just makes it so that people can connect more to these stories. You don't have to be physically be in Jerusalem in this spot to think about one of those people. Instead, you can go to another spot that also you can think of another place where they might be buried. There's an old joke in the tour guide course in Israel that says, he rests in pieces, where it's as if kind of they're all over the place in a way that you can find all these different pieces of their story and put them together. And inside the Dome of the Ascension, it's over here, which again, you can see at some point was a mihrab. Just down below, there is a stone that is said to be where the footprint of Jesus just before he left this earth. And now I'm taking you inside another church that's on the Mount of Olives, which is the Church of the Dominus Flevit, which is designed by the great Italian architect from the 1930s, Antonio Barlucci, or from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Antonio Barlucci, who designed almost all of the Catholic churches in Israel. And what's interesting is that when he designed all of these churches, he did it in a way that, and it was a place that it needed to be sensitive to other faiths, like this church, the Dominus Flevit, which marks the place where Jesus wept over the future destruction of the temple, that instead of looking like a regular Catholic church, which would be filled with icons and statues and images, this in a way is much more friendly to Protestants. If a Protestant would like to come of any of the branches of Protestant Christianity, they could come to this spot over here and think about that moment where Jesus weeps over the future destruction of Jerusalem. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Reverend Diaz to speak a little bit about this spot and this little tiny spot that you can see in the window and what it overlooks over here, which is what's called the Golden Gate. So Reverend Diaz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So yes, so you're on the top of the Mount of Olives, and we just saw where Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem and over the destruction of the temple. And this happened just before he went down from the Mount of Olives. And what the spot that Josh just showed you is a gate. And I think in the Muslim and the Jewish tradition referred to as the mercy gate, or the gate of mercy. In the Christian tradition referred to as the Golden Gate. So I will refer to it as the Golden Gate, but it can also be spoken of as the Mercy Gate or the Gate of Mercy. And this gate that you're looking at is most deeply connected to the celebration of Palm Sunday in Christianity. On Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday a week before the celebration of Easter, Christians celebrate the event of Jesus coming down the mountain and entering into the city of Jerusalem. And he came riding on a donkey, while his followers, as well as some bystanders, waved palm branches and sang Hosanna, or the word Hosanna. And in the Christian scriptures, the first three gospel accounts of these events of Palm Sunday, so the accounts from Matthew and Mark and Luke, appear to indicate that Jesus did in fact come down into the city from the Mount of Olives along that path and immediately arrived at the Temple Mount. The fourth account in the Gospel of John has Jesus, but immediately before this, he's in Bethany with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, which is just beyond the Mount of Olives, really. So he would have passed that way, and John suggests that as Jesus is coming down, that from the Temple Mount, the Pharisees were watching his arrival. Now, it's important that he came from this direction and came through this gate when he entered Jerusalem, because most of Jesus' ministry was carried out in the region of Galilee and other outlying areas. And so his arrival at Jerusalem was believed by the early Christians to have been the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy concerning the Messiah, concerning the coming of the Messiah. And so the evidence, some of the evidence that they offered for this, in part, there's many passages of scripture that they, Christian scripture, that they offer as evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. But one of them was that he came to Jerusalem from the east, from the Mount of Olives or Bethany, and not directly from Galilee. And the assumption by the early Christian church that because he must have come through this particular gate, riding on a donkey with the waving of palm branches, which was all symbolic of the fulfillment of Jewish messianic prophecies. So, for example, we read about this in the Gospel of John, and in the Gospel of John, as he tells the story, he quotes two important scripture passages. He quotes Psalm 118 about God sending salvation to Israel, and he quotes Zechariah 9, which is a prophetic text about the coming of Zion's king. And so this is what the Gospel of John says. It says, "The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, 'Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel.' And Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, 'Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt.'" So this was the scriptural evidence that they had of this event, that this was the fulfillment of prophecy. As I mentioned before, the time of year of this event also was Passover. And because the early Christians were linking Jesus with the sacrificial lamb whose life was sacrificed for the atonement of sins. And then the waving of the palm branches, though, as Jesus rode into Jerusalem, recalled when Judas Maccabeus defeated invaders and cleansed the temple in 164 BC. And so you'll read in some gospel accounts that Jesus was also said to, he came down, he entered in this gate immediately into the Temple Mount and cleansed the temple upon arrival. So that reflects back on Maccabeus as well. It refers back to Maccabeus. And when Maccabeus came and defeated the invaders, his followers entered the city waving palm branches in victory as well, and he and his family became kings of Israel. So there's so much symbolism in there in this act of Palm, what we celebrate on Palm Sunday, that refers to kingship and messianic prophecy. So the significance of this event of Palm Sunday with his arrival through this gate is that the early Christians were saying that Jesus demonstrated that he was the true King of Israel, coming to claim his throne and, of course, setting Israel free. But he does so in a way, as everything he did, he does so in a way that indicates humility, self-sacrifice, and that was something that was not expected, but they felt that even though it wasn't expected, it had been prophesied through the scriptures. So finally, in the other significance of this particular gate is in the Christian study of eschatology. And eschatology is a big word that means just the study of the end times, the study, we now think of it as that study of the second coming, but it's significant in the study of the end times of eschatology that Jesus' appearance from the east directly to the Temple Mount is linked with the sunrise, which symbolizes both Christ's resurrection from the dead and the direction of his second coming, which Jesus had promised and which the early church affirmed as well in the words of the Apostles' Creed. So thank you for that. I'll turn it back over to Josh.
Thank you, Reverend Diaz. And something that really that Antonio Barlucci does in his churches is that he really makes it so that it incorporates the story itself. And the Dominus Flevi Church, which marks where Jesus first weeps over this destruction, he designed the church to look like a teardrop. So it really kind of feels in that kind of way. And I'm actually going to now immediately turn the floor over now to Imam Badat, who's going to explain a little bit about this amazing cemetery that is right in front of the Golden Mercy Gate. It's over here. So Imam Badat, the floor is for you.
Yes, mashallah. So this is a great opportunity where we are learning about various perspectives. So what you see here is the Gate of Mercy. And in particular, this Muslim cemetery is called Babur Rahma, which basically means the cemetery of the Gate of Mercy. And there are a number of Muslim personnel that are buried here. There's some Arabic scripture that you can also see on some of the tombs and the grave sites. But in particular, I want to give reference to two great individuals who are known as the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. And the companions, they are called the ashab. They are called the companions because they spend time with the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. And these two individuals, the first one is Ubadah bin Samit, and he was amongst the very first pioneers who embraced Islam. In fact, when Muhammad started preaching back in Mecca before his migration to the city of Yathrib, or known as Medina, Ubadah bin Samit was studying scriptures of the various prophets and the various scriptures that had been revealed to Moses, to Jesus, etc. And he then heard of the coming of Muhammad. He had some interactions with him, and he was amongst the first 12 of the what we call the Ansari companions who met Muhammad and had some indication that he is a prophet of God. And after the migration of the Prophet Muhammad to Yathrib, where Ubadah bin Samit was from, he embraced Islam. And he became amongst those who was very close to the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. And there are many accolades to his biography. But how did he end up at this location in Jerusalem? It is mentioned that during the Khalifa, during the Caliph period of Umar bin Khattab, which Josh gave reference to earlier, he was actually sent. Ubadah bin Samit was actually sent as a judge to this location for the Muslim populace. And he was there, I would say, about 25 years after the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, had passed away. And he was known for his justice. He was known for his leadership. And there were many who learned the teachings and the traditions of the Prophet of Islam directly through him. And he spent the rest of his life here. And that's why we find his tomb and his grave at this particular location in Jerusalem, in Quds. And many visitors, many pilgrims, particularly Muslims that go, they visit this particular location in memory of this great companion, Ubadah bin Samit. The other companion that I want to quickly give reference to is that of Shaddad ibn Aus. And Shaddad ibn Aus, like Ubadah bin Samit, is a companion of the Prophet, which means that he saw him, he believed in him, and upon his passing, he had firm connection with the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. So Shaddad ibn Aus' story is very unique. He was he had a very difficult life. He was impoverished. And one day he came to the Prophet of Islam complaining about his circumstance and his situation. And at that point, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, forecasted and foretold him that you will be amongst those who enter the holy lands of Sham, the Levant, referring to Jerusalem as well. And the riches and the materials will be expanded for you. And that's exactly what happened. During the various periods of the Islamic glory in this region. He was amongst those who participated, and he became amongst those who was very wealthy as well. And one other thing that was forecasted by the Prophet of Islam in reference to Shaddad ibn Aus, that his offspring will become amongst those who would be imams and religious leaders in Al-Aqsa, in Masjid Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. When it comes to Shaddad ibn Aus, he returned after a certain period of time in this region. He returned back to Medina. He returned back to the Prophet's city. But after the passing of the Prophet, he decided to move back here, and that's why he lived the rest of his life in this region, and he passed away, and we find his tombstone here as well. One last point I want to make about Shaddad ibn Aus, companion of the Prophet of Islam, is that many of his contemporaries, such as Abu Huraira, the Muslims would know who Abu Huraira is. He was a very intellectual companion and disciple of the Prophet of Islam. He often said that when a person has a lot of knowledge, they have less forbearance. But when it came to Shaddad ibn Aus, he had both. He had a lot of knowledge, and he also had forbearance. And he was known to be a great leader. He was known to be a great companion. So these two individuals, they date back all the way to the Prophet of Islam, and their presence here made a mark, and that's why we see their tombstones in this particular cemetery. Thank you.
Imam Badab, before you go, stay unmuted for just a quick second. I've shown these two images from this website, the islamiclandmarks.com. Could you just give like a 20-second, 30-second explanation of what this website is?
Yes, anyone who wants to know about the Islamic perspectives of various landmarks in various parts of the world, this is a great site to visit. It's actually operated by one of my dear friends who's based in the United Kingdom, and he often travels and researches and talks to historians and studies. So he's put this wonderful website together, and all of you are welcome to visit the website, and you'll have an Islamic perspective on various locations throughout the Middle East and beyond. And hopefully that can give you some context of these various locations.
Thank you. Amazing. It's an invaluable resource for anyone who's interested in learning about Islam all over the world, but especially in Israel, Palestine, in this area. So thank you so much. Now, the Golden Gate itself, what you might have noticed about the Golden Gate is that it is blocked off. And it was blocked off since Abd al-Malik. Well, there's various different accounts of who maybe blocked it off, but one of the accounts is that Abd al-Malik, of the end of the 7th century, essentially did a renovation on the whole Temple Mount and blocked up the Golden Gate that's over here. May have been in a way of a theological thing to do, where he's saying to the Christian and Jewish populations of the region, saying, listen, your Messiah is not going to come, and definitely not going to come through this gate. So you've locked it up. But this, in a way, only added to the imagery for Christians and for Jews, and then also for Muslims, who Muhammad will come to the or the 12th prophet will come in the end of days, if you will, for Islam, that this image will be when Muhammad comes with Jesus to judge the people according to Islamic tradition, or for Jesus to judge the people according to Christian tradition, or for the Messiah, the Mashiach, to come for Jewish tradition on their donkey through the gate. Well, now it's just going to burst through the gate and make this really big eruption to really kind of announce the presence of the Messianic age. So in a way, it kind of added to that beautiful image. And what's interesting is actually right next to the gate, on the inside of the Temple Mount, is actually this little pile of wooden beams that are all covered in plastic that's over here. It turns out that these wooden beams, I'm going to get to in just a second, are actually beams that were part of the original first temple complex, that these were here for almost 3,000 years ago, that were taken out during an earthquake in 1927 of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That it's interesting that this is kind of here, just on the side, that you can see, you know, part of 3,000 years of history that's over there. The Golden Gate on the inside, this is one of the earliest images we have of the Golden Gate from the inside. There you can nowadays, because of the protest in 2019, the civil protest by Muslims of Jerusalem, that they protested in order to pray inside to make it a prayer space. And after a few weeks of the civil protest, they have successfully opened it up to prayer for Muslims, but it is off limits for Christians and for Jews to go inside. This is also a site that is holy for Christians because of the scene of Saint Joachim, who is the father of Mary, of the Virgin Mary, who is seen here with his wife Anna, or Hannah, and they are embracing because they have just been told that after many years of wanting children, they will be able to have children. And it happens here at the Golden Gate. So there's a lot of shared holiness here at the Golden Gate between the three religions, which is just a really special, it's a special site. Now we're back on the Temple Mount still, and we're on the northern side of the Temple Mount. And just to not do shared holiness, but some shared history, just very briefly, this minaret that's on the top, the Khawanima minaret, is the tallest of 4 minarets that exist on the Temple Mount. And it just so happens that this was also the place where Herod built his incredibly tall structure on the northern wall, on the northwestern part of the Temple Mount complex, in order to look over the temple. So it's just this interesting parallel that takes place 2,000 or 1,500 years apart from when they were built from each other. There's another beautiful dome that's known as the Dome of Solomon, which, according to Muslim tradition, local Muslim tradition, it is this dome that protects some stones that, when the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, that there were some Jews who took some of the stones from the temple and brought them with them to Babylon. And then 70 years later, with the reconstruction of the temple, the building of the second temple, they brought those stones back. And according to a Muslim tradition, not a Jewish tradition, a Muslim tradition, this is the dome that protects those stones. And it's just interesting that it started as a Muslim tradition, which then, of course, became adopted by the Jews. And once you have a Muslim tradition that's adopted by the Jewish population, then, of course, the Christians also tag along too. So again, it's these shared traditions that then everyone ends up holding. I can't go to the Temple Mount without going into the two of the most stunning buildings in the whole world, let alone in Jerusalem, where now we are inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the southern edge of the Temple Mount, which you can see all the people who are praying here, which is, it always makes me think about growing up as a kid in synagogue, where in synagogues, generally people sit far away from the center. But what I love about mosques, and that you can see very clearly in this image over here, is that it's traditionally that you sit in the middle, that you gather together as close as possible. I guess social distancing nowadays, it makes it a little bit less possible to do that. But one of the things I want to show you is next to the mihrab, there's this, the minbar. Now this minbar over here is a very pretty minbar, but originally it was this. The original minbar that was here was the minbar of Salah ad-Din, who is the Ayyubid general who essentially defeated the Crusaders in 1187 CE and built this minaret over here in order to honor that, in order to commemorate that amazing event in history. And unfortunately, in the 1960s, there was a deranged tourist that came and burnt it down. And it's this incredible, incredible loss that this beautiful pulpit, this beautiful minbar, was destroyed. And it's because of that that non-Muslims are not allowed to enter into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And later on, those laws were extended that that non-Muslims are not allowed to enter into the Dome of the Rock as well. And it's just kind of this sad thing that you can't go and that not everyone can go and appreciate these beautiful, stunning buildings. And the interior of the dome is even more beautiful than the exterior, where you have the incredible calligraphy all around the edges and all of the beautiful patterns and geometric patterns that define Islamic artwork. And again, the ceiling that you can see in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it's just really unbelievable and beautiful. Underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque is what's called Solomon's Stables, which actually has nothing to do with Solomon. This is a name that the Crusaders gave when the Crusaders turned the Al-Aqsa Mosque into the palace of the king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so underneath the palace, the king kept his horses. And so they found this area with all these arches, and they called it the Stables of Solomon, even though these arches were built 1,000 years after Solomon by King Herod, but that never stopped the Crusaders from naming it the way it was. And you can see kind of these old images of what the Stables of Solomon were, which for Muslims it is called the Al-Marwani Mosque, which you can see by the carpets that it has been turned into a mosque here as well. But it's just a really beautiful structure that is on the bottom over here. You can see now that from the eastern side of the dome of the Temple Mount, you can see the Dome of the Rock, the Quba al-Sakhra, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on this side that's over here. As I mentioned before, it was destroyed in 1927 by an earthquake, which actually gave a couple opportunities for archaeologists to poke around and find some things, including not just the wood from the temple that I showed you before, which some of these pieces of wood date back to the second temple from 2,000 years ago, and some of them date back to the first temple from 3,000 years ago. But what's interesting that was also found was this mosaic. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the tour that in early Christianity, the Temple Mount was basically, it was a literal garbage dump that they wiped it off the map. They didn't want, the new temple became the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But as it turns out, underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they found this mosaic, which perfectly matched the mosaic of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, which made people wonder, maybe, just maybe, there was a church here as well. There was indeed Christian activity up on the Temple Mount during those first few centuries of the Byzantine Empire, which is just like a really interesting thing to think about, and one that we could never really know for sure. And again, going back to our theme about shared histories and about different people contributing to different spots. So there's all these domes that are all around the Temple Mount complex, or the Haram al-Sharif, as it is known in Arabic. So we're gonna go into the Dome of the Rock in just a second, but I want to focus on this spot that's over here, which is known as the Dome of the Ascension, which is known as the Dome of the Ascension because there is an early Muslim tradition that actually this dome over here is the dome where Muhammad goes up to heaven to debate with God and Jesus and Moses about how many times a day Muslims should pray. Now, eventually that tradition moves to the Dome of the Rock itself, but there was a tradition that it was this dome that's over here. And what's interesting is that this dome was not originally built by Muslims, but this was built by the Crusaders. You can see that it has this beautiful Crusader architecture, and that it was a baptismal pool for the Crusaders. And if you zoom in to the top of that dome over here, there's all these little tiny miniature pillars that all have these different animals that all have, again, these different symbols and different meanings in Christian tradition. Now, the other Kuba, or the other dome that I wanted to take you to, is actually this one that's over here, which is a dome that looks kind of small and insignificant. But what's interesting about it that makes it different than all the other domes on the complex is that it is the only dome that there is nothing underneath, literally nothing. And what's underneath is, again, the bare rock of Mount Moriah, of the holy mountain. Now, again, all this is about just this holy mountain that's over here. And this is the only spot in the whole Temple Mount complex that anyone, not just Muslims who can go inside the Dome of the Rock, that anyone can see the bare stone of the Temple Mount of Mount Moriah. And it's called Kubat Aluach. Now, Aluach makes historians, this word in Arabic, the Aluach makes historians kind of think a little bit, ring some bells, because Luach in Hebrew means like the tablets, the Luchot Abrit, the tablets, that were the Ten Commandments. So maybe, just maybe, this is actually the place, based on the Arabic name, that this is maybe the place where the temple really was, where the Mishkan, where the tabernacles were kept, where those tablets were kept. Because this is often the case all throughout the Holy Land, all throughout Israel, Palestine, where it is often the Arabic names that preserve the biblical or ancient Hebrew or ancient Jewish tradition of a specific place because of that similarities between Hebrew and Arabic. And it's really interesting. I don't know, it's interesting dynamic in that way that I wish I had more time to get into with you. There's another little tiny dome that's off in the corner that's over here, which is known as the Kubat al-Khader, which is dedicated to Elijah the prophet, or al-Khader, or Saint George, depending on the three different religions that you're connected to, all three of whom have similar stories and similar tales about them. And now we're about to move into the Dome of the Rock, but what I wanted to show you just over here is that this is perfectly in line with that Dominus Flevit church, where again, this is the teardrop church was perfectly in line with the Dome of the Rock. And in front of the Dome of the Rock, you have this Kubat al-Sisla, which we don't really know that much about, other than that it's in the exact geometric center of the temple. And the reason why it's there is because why that's the geometric center, not the golden Dome of the Rock, is because the Dome of the Rock is actually a little bit closer to the western side of the Temple Mount complex. And essentially, Kubat al-Sisla, the chain dome, would actually sit something like this in the courtyard of the Temple Mount. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because it was such a beautiful structure, is such a beautiful structure, and might actually be the older, according to some historians, they think that this building might actually be the oldest of all of the buildings on the Temple Mount, where the Knights Templar, the Knights of the Crusaders, were so wowed by this structure that they included it onto their own seal, which is just a really interesting fact about that. Let's actually go inside the Dome of the Rock. And again, inside the Dome of the Rock for Jews, this is the holiest site in the world. It is on this rock over here that the Holy of Holies once stood, where the high priest only once a year would enter, on Yom Kippur would enter and speak directly to God. That this is this incredible, incredible spot that for Jews for the last 2,000 years have had very, very little access to. I mean, even before 2,000 years when it was just the high priest, presumably there was no access as well. I guess there's more access now than there was back then. But this is a place that is completely off limits to non-Muslims nowadays, basically since the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s. And there's all these little kind of pieces taken off of the Dome of the Rock. Some of it, some historians believe, are the places where either the tabernacle once stood, or maybe there was a baptismal pool. There's a number of different things that may have been used for religious purposes. But a lot of the chunks that have been taken off, some of it might have just been people who were just so wowed by this incredible structure that they came here, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, who wanted to take a piece of history home with them and take a little piece of the holiest stone in the entire world. And you have up above just this really stunning, beautiful interior of the Islamic artwork. That the Dome of the Rock is actually the oldest surviving Muslim building that's survived completely intact in the world. When it was built in the 690s. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was built a couple of decades before, but as I showed you before, earthquakes have destroyed it a couple of times here and there. This is just, again, a view of what the Dome of the Rock looks like. Now, again, this is a beautiful structure that isn't just holy to Jews, but is also holy to Muslims. And inside this spot that's over here, you have you have some of Muhammad's beard hairs, but also what's really special about this spot is that there's this footprint of Muhammad going up to heaven. There's a footprint in the stone of Muhammad going up to heaven before to debate about how many times a day Muslims should pray, which again makes you think about that Church of the Ascension from before. And underneath the Dome of the Rock, you can see all of the people who are praying, that there's actually this little well of souls that's over here, which is from a Christian tradition, that this is the spot in the Well of Souls that the Holy of Holies once resided. Now, once that became a Christian tradition, so for Muslims, that also became part of the Muslim tradition as well. This is where the Holy of Holies was. And once it was a Christian and a Muslim tradition, So for Jews, this also became part of Jewish tradition as well, that the Holy of Holies, that the tabernacle was kept underneath the rock. Eventually that tradition for Jews changed a little bit. But what's interesting is that when they were recarpeting just a few years ago, they found these ancient mosaic marble tiles. And what's underneath the marble tiles is also something that's interesting, that no one's been there since the 1800s. But underneath the marble tiles, there's a theory, there's an account of this explorer named Peyrodi, who found another cave underneath over here, which has a tunnel that presumably would have allowed for water to come in for the high priests of the temple to use, and for blood and garbage and water and different things like that to go out, to drain it out of the temple. But again, we're sitting in this spot that's over here, which is the holiest spot in the world for Jews, and of the third or fourth, or however you want to say it, holiest site for Muslims, and also this incredibly historic and beautiful site for Christians as well. And I'm going to turn the floor over now to Rabbi Wernick to help explain a little bit about essentially the next spot, that if Jews didn't have access to the Temple Mount for 2,000 years, so the holiness in a way shifted down to the Western Wall, which now is thought to be, in a way, by most Jews and most people around the world, to be the holiest site in the world for Jews. And Rabbi Wernick, can you tell us a little bit about the Western Wall and some of your own activities here?
Thanks, Josh. So as you said, the holiest site for Judaism is still the spot on the Temple Mount in which the temple stood, and specifically the Holy of Holies that contained the Ark of the Covenant and the tablets of the commandment. That spot is like looking at this picture. You see the Dome of the Rock. It's perhaps there or a little bit more to the left. No one's really quite sure. Since the Romans destroyed the temple, there's a legend that is preserved by Josephus, for example, that says that the Romans left the Western Wall still standing as a symbol of the might of Rome and what they were able to destroy. And immediately following the destruction and the siege of Jerusalem, there was yet another diaspora and exile. And one of the reasons why the Western Wall is sometimes referred to in English as the Wailing Wall is because Jews, for a short period of time, but for a number of years, were not able to come into Jerusalem. The closest they could get perhaps was Bethlehem, and they would gather on the 9th of Av, the Hebrew month of Av, in which they would remember and mourn the loss of the temple and cry. And so this wall was known as the Wailing Wall. Jews certainly, since the advent of Zionism more than 120 years ago, Jews would certainly not refer to it as the Wailing Wall. That's a sign of loss, and Zionism represents the rebirth of Judaism as a nation, and Israel, of course, represents the rebirth of that nation in sovereignty. One of the things that you can see here in the picture that Josh is now showing is a picture from the 1920s when the Western Wall in Jerusalem was under a British mandate, and what you can see is that men and women would pray together at this spot. Now, it's important to remember that at that time, the prayers that they would recite were not communal prayers. The communal prayers require traditionally a quorum of 10 men and have the recitation of certain prayers that are considered to be elevated in holiness as a result of the presence of that community. For over 30 years, there's been a movement of women that have sought to go to the Western Wall since the foundation of Israel, and certainly almost immediately after the Six-Day War in June of 1967. The Israeli authorities, decided to maintain the Jordanian Waqf as having the religious authority for the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, things that happened on the Temple Mount itself, but they took the area in front of the Kotel, in front of the Western Wall, and they turned it into an Orthodox synagogue, one of the features of which is the separation of men and women in prayer. For about 30 years now, maybe almost 35 years, there's been a movement of women that have met on the first of the Jewish month, it's called Rosh Chodesh, to come together and to try and to pray as a women's only minyan, as a women's only quorum of Jewish adults. And they have been met, especially in recent years, with really with terrible behavior to try to dissuade them from coming. This is one of the challenges that Jews have with the modern state of Israel, and that is that the public religious authority is a very orthodox religious authority. And so ironically, Israel in some ways is the Jewish state, but not all Jewish expressions are allowed to take place in public spaces that are under the auspices of the religious authorities of Israel, which are primarily Orthodox. About 5-6 years ago, this came to a head when one of the women, the leaders of Women of the Wall, a woman named Anat Hoffman, was arrested in Israel for carrying a Sefer Torah, the scrolls of Moses. And that set off a controversy that in my previous job, when I was the head of the conservative movement in North America, I was invited by Prime Minister Netanyahu to negotiate a solution to the challenges of pluralism at this site. It was myself, the leaders of the Reform movement, the leaders of the Federated Jewish Community, and the Jewish Agency for Israel, which was then led by Natan Sharansky, that met with Netanyahu to negotiate a resolution, which we did. And that resolution involved this site that you're seeing now, which is called the Southern Wall. And all that means it's the southern part of the Kotel, of the Western Wall. If you can go back to that first picture, Josh, that shows the Muhrabi ramp as well. The Kotel itself, the Western Wall itself is about the length of 3 football fields. And the Kotel that we see is only a third of that. So this section where all the people is the traditional Kotel as we know it. And south of the Muhrabi ramp, which is the ramp by which non-Muslims enter the Temple Mount. South of that is the Southern Wall excavation, but it's all the same wall. And so the resolution that we negotiated was that Southern Wall would be built up to be a place of dignified prayer for pluralistic Jewish religious traditions, and the Northern Wall, the northern part of the wall would continue in Orthodox fashion. And then there were other things that we negotiated. It was 4 years of very, very complicated negotiations, but we finally reached a settlement. That solution was then went to the Israeli government. The Israeli government approved it. And then a year later, they tabled it due to the internal politics of Israel, again, relating to the Orthodox religious establishment and the challenges that Israel have. So on the one hand, you have this site, which its holiness is not anything intrinsic to the wall itself, but it is as close to the Holy of Holies, to the place where the temple stood, where the Ark of the Covenant was, that Jews can get today. And so we go to the Western Wall as a way to get as close as we can to what is the holiest site. And yet this site is also a place of controversy, not only between Jews and Muslims in terms of the status of Jerusalem and the religious nature of what's on top and what's below, but also, unfortunately, is a site of controversy for Jews amongst ourselves in terms of how do we create, how does Israel, as the homeland for the Jewish people, create opportunities for the totality of the Jewish people and all of its breadth and diversity to have a sense of belonging at this holy site. It's something that I was involved with, as Josh said, quite personally for 4 years, with lots and lots of negotiations between the parties, between our parties and the Israeli government, and then the government had to negotiate also with the archaeologists as well as with the Waqf. You can just imagine how complicated it was and it remains. And I remain hopeful that one day the political circumstances will allow for this agreement to be taken back onto the table and to be implemented, so that you can see not only these many people here on the northern plaza of the Western Wall, but as many on the southern plaza as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Warnick. I had to apologize to everyone before because I wasn't supposed to speak about inside the Dome of the Rock, and because I was looking at the clock and I was too rushed for time. Imam Badat, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to speak much more coherently than I could ever speak in what I did speak about inside the Kuba as-Sakhra. And so I hand the floor over back to you.
Yeah, not a problem, Josh. You did a pretty good job. So in the interest of time, I'll just make it brief. This whole space where these two mosques are structured, both the Dome of the Rock as well as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this whole space is actually considered Haram al-Sharif, as you pointed out, which is basically a place to pray. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa Mosque, anywhere in this space. And I've been there several times with some Canadian pilgrims, particularly on the Friday. This whole space becomes a prayer space. And it's considered the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this whole space, even though we have these two particular structures. Now, coming back to the Dome of the Rock, there's quite a significance for the Muslims here, as pointed out by Josh. And it is basically because one of the greatest events took place in the life of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, from this very stone or this space. And that is the ascension of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, to the heavens and beyond. And not only was the discussion about the number of prayers, but rather it was sort of like a royal tour given to Muhammad of the heavens and the hellfire, and he met several prophets in a spiritual sense, and including Moses and Jesus, and he was given several gifts by God in terms of prayers and supplications, and then he returned back. And miraculously, this all took place in the fraction of the night, as is the belief of Muslims that God has the power to do anything. He is the supreme being, and therefore this extraordinary event is recorded in the Quran and also expanded in the traditions which we call the Hadith. Now, this particular structure, as pointed out by Josh, was built by Caliph Abdul Malik in the 680s or closer towards the 690s. There was a period of time where the Crusaders had blocked this whole space off, where Jews were restricted as well as Muslims. And in fact, these were not significant places of worship during that period. But after the arrival of Salahuddin and him restoring this space as a place of worship and significance to both Jews and Muslims as well as Christians, and as was said earlier, that this is the very space where Jews and Christians believe that Abraham sacrificed his son Isaac. The story is also recorded in the Quran, but Muslims do not believe this is the space where Abraham made the attempt to sacrifice his son. Rather, it was in Mecca. That is a slight difference there, but we do share the same story and the spirit of the story. I believe, according to the Jewish tradition, this is also the space where it's considered the center of the earth. From the Islamic perspective, this is also the very stone or the space where angel Israfil will actually blow the trumpet to herald Judgment Day, which will commence the Judgment Day. And also, when we look at the structure, as was pointed out, is very beautiful. There's a lot of Quranic scripture. There's also each pillar has a significance. You know, in some sections, there's 12 pillars signifying the 12 months of the year. In some areas of this Dome of the Rock, you have 7 mihrabs, which is 7 niches of prayer, again signifying the 7 days of the week. And then you have 52 windows signifying the weeks of the year. Then we have in some specific areas 8 pillars, which refers to the 8 angels that are that are with the throne of God the Almighty. So on and so forth. It's been very meticulously put together, and there's a lot of significance in how it has been structured and built. The last point I want to make here is that underneath, as was pointed out by Josh, is that there's the soul of there's the well of the souls. Now, as was pointed out, this is more of a Christian tradition, but many Muslim theologians do not agree with this tradition. They just feel that Muslims generally just feel that this is the space where Muhammad ascended and he was invited to the heavens on a royal tour, and it's a significant place to pray and to turn to God. But there is this understanding that it could be the space where souls are gathered to await the judgment day, etc. But again, scholars and theologians do not necessarily agree with this theme. So that's a little information from the Islamic perspective. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Imam. And once again, I'm sorry for glossing over, and you did an amazing job as you've done throughout all of this. Now, I'm going to finish with everyone just looking from the roof of the Austrian hospice. Next time you guys go to Jerusalem, I highly, highly recommend you heading over to the Austrian hospice, not just because it's the best place in all of Israel, Palestine to get real strudel, but when you go up to the roof over there, you're able to really see kind of a gorgeous, stunning view of the old city, where you can see, so actually this is the roof of the Austrian hospice. This is actually a higher up roof than the Austrian hospice. This one over here is the Austrian hospice. The one that's over here, only Google Maps has access to. But from over here, you can see a view that sees the whole of the old city of Jerusalem. And while we're over here, I wanted to play for you a song to conclude our time. And then after that, I'm happy to stay and take some questions and if we want to do breakout rooms. But I'm gonna play this one song for you and then we will call it an evening.
Listen, children, to a story that was written long ago about a kingdom on a mountain and the valley folk below. On the mountain was a treasure buried deep beneath a stone, and the valley people swore they'd have it for their very own. Go ahead and hit your neighbor, go ahead and cheat your friend, do it in the name of heaven, justified in the end. There won't be any trumpets blowing come the judgment day, on the bloody morning after. One tin soldier rides away.
This song is it's a song by a band called The Original Cast, which is a Canadian folk song, which I always grew up with going to camp and loving this song so much. And since doing these virtual tours of Jerusalem and actually going inside the Dome of the Rock and really exploring the interfaith aspects of Jerusalem, even more virtually than I do it in person as well, but virtually you can really jump from place to place and really see these parallels really quickly right in between. And what's amazing about this song is about this battle that's taking place between people, and they're fighting and they're trying to fight over this one stone, and there's endless slaughter that takes place. And at the end of the day, when the people find the treasure that's underneath this stone that they've been fighting over, it's a little piece of paper that says peace on earth. The city Jerusalem, the name Jerusalem comes from the Hebrew Ir Shalom, the city of peace. That ironically, Jerusalem is a city that has known very few years of peace in its 3,000, 4,000 years of history. And I hope that the sense you got from this tour is that there is this dialogue that takes place between all three religions. And yes, there was lots of needless bloodshed that took place between all of the religions and any number of different peoples that came through here. But that nowadays we can take it upon ourselves to take all these traditions that once during different periods were at war with each other, but now you can see just really add to each other's experience. And I hope that that's really the message that you come with today, that Jerusalem can be the city that unites people together, and that there's enough space for everyone to pray and for everyone to call it holy, and not to be a place that divides us and continues to cause us to war with each other. And with that, because we've definitely ran over time, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Rabbi Wernick, who's going to tell us what's going to happen next. Just see, Rabbi Wernick, I'm happy to stay and answer questions from the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to do the breakout rooms as was planned, but the floor is back to you. But again, thank you all so much for the tour. My name is Josh Hartuv, and you can email me anytime, josh@hartuvtours.com, and you can feel free to message me that way if you have any questions about anything or any tours that you'd like to bring to your communities or friends or things like that at home where you're from. And thank you all so much. Once again, I really enjoyed it all.
Thank you, Josh. I just want to say we're not going to break into the breakout rooms. Apparently that technology is not available on the webinar function. I did open the chat for people to ask questions or to make their comments. I see that there's a question, is it safe to travel nowadays? Well, it's not totally safe yet to travel because of COVID. If you're asking, is it safe to travel to the Middle East, to Israel, to the West Bank, or to Gaza, I encourage you to check on Canada's website for travel. And to talk to your own contacts. I certainly believe it's safe to travel to Israel and to certain areas within the West Bank. That's for me. For other people, it's different circumstances. But you should always check with the experts and to see what you're interested in doing. You should know that it's through the Neighborhood Interfaith group that the Sons of Abraham tour was created. That of course is on hiatus now because of the certain circumstance. But God willing, maybe when COVID lifts, we can take this tour on the road and we can go together and see these sites and more in person. Meet Josh as well. I don't see any other questions at this time. This has been recorded. Once it uploads, we'll send it to the Neighborhood Interfaith group so that perhaps all the different churches, mosques, and synagogues that are part of it will be able to have it so that you can access it. I just want to thank Josh in particular for leading us on this wonderful tour. I want to thank Iman Badat and Reverend Diaz for their collegiality, partnership, and friendship in making this happen, and to Kevin Carpenter and the entire Neighborhood Interfaith group for this wonderful, wonderful evening. We hope and we pray in our various faith traditions, but I'm sure we all pray for the same thing at this moment. And that is that COVID find a vaccine or some cure by which we can be together in person safely. In the interim, we encourage people to follow the directives of the medical health professionals, to wear masks, to practice physical distancing, and to wash your hands regularly with soap and water and with antibacterial rinses. And we also pray, as I think we demonstrated this evening, that as human beings, we have much more in common than those things that separate us. And we should always work to make sure that we emphasize what we share over where we disagree, and where we do disagree, to do so with respect and understanding, as being all children of God who perhaps approach God in a multiple different ways of culture and tradition. So thank you all for being here, and I just want to say good night.
great evening. It was really nice to take part with all of you guys. This was really special. It was such a wonderful experience. And yeah, I look forward to the next one, and hopefully it'll be in person, but you know, we'll figure out another time. That was really, really wonderful. And I see you guys answered a lot of these questions that you guys did throughout, and I love all the love for the One Tin Soldier song. Like, I never really thought of it as related to Jerusalem until like starting to do these virtual tours, and it really just like hits. It's right on. If anyone's still on and wants to ask any questions, you can feel free to ask. But I think with that, I think we're ready to go. Thank you all so much. I really
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for including me in this wonderful event.
Bye, everyone. Have a
Bye.
good evening.
Bye.